This is Greg Trelwine with Maritime Reporter TV, and we're very pleased to be joined again by Phil Lewis, the Director of Research, Intelatus Global Partners, to discuss the findings in his latest report on U.S. offshore wind. Phil, to start, why don't you give us a brief overview, a by-the-numbers look at U.S. offshore wind today, which lends insight to the size and scope of the market and the potential?
Oh, sure thing, Greg. I mean, just putting it in the context, let's look at the world globally. So, there's around 75 gigawatts of offshore wind farms, either operational or being built in the world today. Now, if we compare that with the US, which is what we're talking about today, the US currently has 42 megawatts of operational offshore wind farms, and there's one wind farm for 800 megawatts that's finally under construction. So contextually, what we have that seems to be a bit smaller, but things are, well, in our view, things are really about to change in quite a big way. One more wind farm will start work, construction work this quarter. We've got 11 offshore continental shelf projects are under final federal permitting review. There's 17.5 gigawatts of project capacity has secured commitments from states. That means they've got power purchase commitments. 16.5 gigawatts of federal offshore leasing in the northeast, South Atlantic, and California is underway for new project capacity. Now, all of this is detailed in our new report, as you mentioned, and we forecast over in the report over 46 projects that will install 43 gigawatts of capacity. So, that's compared to that global 75. So that puts the US in quite in actually from a very small player in the offshore wind segment to quite a substantial player, a very major player in the offshore wind segment very quickly. And all of this will require those projects. Well, those first 43 projects will require about $135 billion of capex. So it's quite a substantial investment, and close to $4.5 billion of annual OPEX once they've been delivered.
Across our media properties, maritime, offshore, subsea, ports, and logistics, it seems like there has been a steady stream of news, positive news coming out about U.S. offshore wind of late. And I noted in your latest report that you described the situation around the U.S. offshore wind as quote unquote more positive at the start of 2022. Quite simply, what has changed in the past year?
In 2020, we are actually a lot more positive. And this is really found on three main developments. And if we look at those developments, I'd say despite the award of federal leases containing over 20 gigawatts of project capacity and state offshore wind goals of over 30 gigawatts, so I mean that's your supply and demand base, and these are well established because these have been established over several years. There's still been some nervousness amongst developers and the supply chain companies to make those domestic investments to support the potential. So one of the things that's really changed is I think the White House statement on offshore wind last year was a real signal. Now, recognizing that the US operates at a very federal level, but this signal was very important to the developers and the supply chain, because the states are obviously focused on state requirements, whereas a federal target and plan gives those developers and supply chain that long-term redeployment. I wouldn't say certainty, but reduces the risk of that, which is obviously a concern to people making very substantial investments. So the White House, they've come up with this deployment target of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 and an aspiration of 110 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2050. And this has really given some confidence to the industry as a whole. So if we look at concrete steps, what that really means is, well, federal support, this federal support that we've talked about, like the White House statement and the top-down push, has resulted in a really concerted effort by federal agencies to progress the review of projects, which were taking longer than they originally planned, and also to develop a future pipeline of wind leasing opportunities to create that long-term activity. And as a result, one project is now fully permitted. That's a Vineyard project, which got a lot of press, and that's already broken ground. And a second project, South Fork, is in the very last days of the permitting. It's gone through those major hurdles, but it's still got a few final permits to do, and it's expected to start construction in this quarter. And there's a clear pathway for the review and approval of 10 other construction applications to the federal government, some covering multiple projects. And BOEM has indicated the potential for at least 7 more leases, or lease sales, I should say, by 2025. And the first one's already ongoing with the New York Bight lease that's ongoing for several leases. And finally, state procurements and new federal leasing requirements are underpinning significant supply chain investment in component factories and ports in the US. So in the White House statement referred to wanting 1 or 2 key component factories in each of the commodities. And that's a year ago, it was almost, well, yeah, that sounds a bit unrealistic. This year, that's really happening. And we're seeing those investments being made because people are certain about the redeployment side.
In looking at U.S. offshore wind, a question mark since day one has been focused on Jones Act vessels. In your view, why haven't more vessels been ordered to date? And could shortages of vessels, particularly WTIVs, potentially slow project developments?
The Jones Act does mean that demand for US-built known vessels will increase. I mean, there is simply no option if wind farms are to be built on time. But you are right to refer to WTIVs, wind turbine installation vessels, which obviously, as the name suggests, installs the turbines, but also quite often the foundations. Until now, there's only one Jones Act vessel that's been, that is actually under construction. That's for Dominion, being built at Keppel Brownsville. And that's been booked on several projects already. And by the looks of it, really for the turbines, it might do a bit of foundation work, but it's going to be very busy doing lots of turbines. Now, a foreign flag vessel, wind turbine installation vessel, has been booked for Vineyard, and it can do that, supported obviously by Jones Act feeder spreads. We have questions about efficiency there, especially as at the moment there are many plans for specific offshore wind feeder spreads that are Jones Act, but we've not really seen them built. We've seen lots of plans, lots of designs, lots of concepts, but actual construction of these vessels, which will aid the productivity of projects, no, it's not happening. So at the moment, it's still tugs and barge spreads because the lift boats in the Gulf of Mexico, most of them are just not big enough. They were big enough for the Block Island wind farm. They're not big enough for these much, much bigger turbines and components you're going to see in the next generation of wind farms. So the vessels we talked about, the Dominion's vessel and the one working on Vineyard, well, basically they're not going to be able to meet all the turbine and foundation requirements of US wind projects. There are going to be more needed, and specifically in the 24 to 26 window. That window coincides with when there is going to be a peak in offshore wind activity at a global scale. The European market, the Asian market are upswinging with some very, very large projects, all featuring the largest turbines and foundations. More countries coming in to build offshore wind farms, just like the US. And all this activity happening at the same time where the supply side, the vessel side, isn't really growing as much as it should, especially because technically a lot of the existing fleet are technically incapable of installing the large turbines, the high heights and the heavy weights of the new turbine developments. I mean, some are being upgraded, but that takes them out of the supply side while they're being upgraded. They're still also working on European and Asian projects. So we definitely see some tightness in the market there, a potential undersupply, which could impact on developer programs and costs. And one thing we've done in particular in our report is we've taken all the developer plans, but actually rather look at individual projects. We've come up with our view of project sequencing of how projects will be used and how assets and marine assets will be used. So obviously some assets will be used very efficiently over multiple projects, but that takes them out of the supply side as well. And we look at the supply side of vessels and the demand side for vessels, not just in the US, but globally. And you must look at that global context because of the lack of Jones Act vessels. Actually, the number of realistic Jones Act vessels that are going to be built is still a question. And also, what wind turbine installation vessel companies find is their vessels are dedicated to the turbines and the foundation. If the US is going floating wind, which it will do, in addition to bottom fixed wind, it's going to need different installation vessels. So some people may not be willing to make that long-term investment in a asset that may not be able to be reused. And also because of the construction costs of the US, which is significantly higher than South Korean yards or Chinese yards, for wind turbine installation vessels, they're unlikely to be able to redeploy the vessel outside of the US market at cost competitive rates. On the crew transfer vessels and SOVs, CTVs, SOVs, if you want to use the industry term, that we still see relatively limited activity. And these vessels must be Jones Act, because they're going to be going into US ports, collecting US passengers, bringing them to a US coastwise point, that which defines it being a Jones Act, a fixed installation offshore. So they're going to have to be Jones Act. Now, currently, there are 3 CTVs, that's it, and a further 5 under construction. Now, we've done a very detailed forecast based on developer plans, and this is significantly shorter than the demand we're forecasting. Same story when you look at the SOV segment. There's 1 vessel confirmed, rumors of others, obviously, but one that's actually only confirmed. And again, that's significantly lower. And even with the rumored vessels, that's significantly lower than that which is needed. And, in the report, we explain why we think that. And it's not a simple question of 1 project, 1 boat, but it's more how they get sequenced to be able to do that. So it's a bit more nuanced.
In that same vein, over the years, we've obviously seen some non-Jones Act vessels working in the traditional U.S. offshore oil and gas market, and in fact, even in the new U.S. offshore wind sector. Do you expect to see more foreign flag vessels working in the offshore wind, given the lack of new Jones Act tonnage?
I do. And like in the oil and gas segment, quite simply, some of these assets are very high capital expenditure. And if they cannot be fully utilized over several years in the US market, they need to go overseas. If they're Jones Act vessels, and one of the issues of Jones Act vessels is they are comparatively more expensive than, let's say, a South Korean or Chinese built vessel. And it makes Jones Act vessels sometimes, quite difficult to compete with overseas. So that's why there is some flexibility in some of the trades, and with the bigger vessels and the bigger segments, to obviously allow larger vessels, and also under the Jones Act rulings, which is done by the Customs and Border Protection Agency, CBP. They do make rulings on the Jones Act to actually interpret if an activity requires a Jones Act vessel or doesn't. And we've already seen some initial rulings made on the offshore wind segment, and we expect further rulings to come. So it's not cut and dry. I mean, developers are clearly indicating that they plan a mix of Jones Act vessels and foreign flag vessels. If there were Jones Act vessels, they may use them, but they are also planning to use foreign flag vessels to supplement that. So there are opportunities for both, and big opportunities for both, and for the US shipyards and the foreign shipyards and the equipment suppliers, or all of these areas.
Let's shift gears for a moment, because obviously this is not just talking about ships and shipbuilding or boats, but supply chain as well. So outside of the vessel discussion, do you see any gaps on the marine side of the U.S. offshore wind supply chain? And if so, what do you see as the most challenging today?
Let's look at the software side for a minute, because we talked about hardware. Now, there's clearly a large pool of qualified, or I should say experienced US seafarers. But they're not necessarily experienced in offshore wind, per se, but they as seafarers, marine crew, there is plenty of good experience. But I would anticipate training is required for the specific crew competencies for offshore wind construction. So when you have a Jones Act installation vessel, you're still going to need tower crane operators. You're still going to need the riggers that are very good riggers, but may not necessarily be familiar with the complexities of the turbines or things like that. And it's quick training, and it's training that's needed. But these are all the sorts of software skills that will be built up. And you see outreach programs going on from quite a few of the wind farm developers, including to the fishing industry. And there have been some studies over that, of looking with the seasonal side of the fishing industry about with the qualifications that some people within that industry have being readily transferred into offshore wind segment, or those that may not have the necessary qualifications, what they need to do to get qualifications to do that. So there has been quite an amount of work done on how to work with the existing good experience in both offshore oil and gas, but also the fishing industry for offshore wind. So software side is definitely, as I say, competency development training. That's always going to be ongoing and during the operations and maintenance, but it's going to create lots of good local jobs, which is clearly what both the states procuring the power and the federal government is aligned to. Also, I just as picking on one specific area, just to give you an example on the hardware side, when we look at building Jones Act vessels, obviously the Jones Act does allow for materials to be brought in from overseas, but raw materials, but without processing or with very minimum processing. So you could bring in a sheet of steel, for instance, specialist steel that may not be produced by a US mill, or you can bring in some aluminium, but it can't necessarily have been worked on, shaped, welded, or something like that with some of the processes. And we have seen Jones Act ruling recently in the crew transfer vessel segment around importing aluminium panels with a certain amount of work, which is done from a manufacturer in Europe, which European crew boat builders get their panels from. They assemble those panels. But under a Jones Act ruling, because there's been some processing done on that, it means it actually contravenes the Jones Act. So that's created a little problem, because quite simply, it isn't there in the US. It can be done, but just because the actual automated supply chain isn't there, that means the cost to the builder is going to be more, well, the boat owner, because the builder's going to have to spend more man hours doing the processing of that raw material. So it can still be a foreign material with processing. So again, there's lots of nuances and details. I'm not a lawyer, you still got to refer to the legal interpretations and the lawyers for that. And there's some great lawyers doing some really good work on this and putting up quite a few cases, but we're beginning to see some cases coming up, and that's giving us some indications of how that impacts the supply chain.
Just discussing some of the topics, I know the investment in time and effort to keep up on this fast changing market is substantial. So your new report's out. What specifically does it offer to this audience who is either in or considering being in the U.S. offshore wind sector?
Well, I'd say just to explain the package, what we do is every month there's a report, there's a database, so the subscribers to our service get access to this database, which is constantly updated with a wide range of supply chain and developer information. The report itself, we report on the granular level of those projects, but it's the analysis that's done to actually make sense of it, to translate what it really means and where the opportunity is. And it's at that granular level, it gives us our unique approach of analyzing developer clustering approaches. We refer to this as project clustering, where they bring multiple projects together in a cluster. Now, once you start looking at the construction schedules of these projects, you see the sequential nature of activity, and that begins to enable you to make some clearer forecasts around supply chain requirements. And that's very important for the supply chain and people in the supply chain to understand that, numbers of vessels, for instance, or numbers of factories that will be required. Is there going to be oversupply, undersupply? Where are they going? And I'd say that nuanced, granular approach allows people to understand that. It gives them that roadmap to really understand that. And within that, within the report, within the database, we update our forecast on a monthly basis at a project level, but not just at a project level. We break it down into component spending. So we're showing where the money's being spent and at what time it's being spent. And that is also included in, as I said, in the detailed contracts database. We also have a contacts function as well indicating main contacts within the developer and tier 1, tier 2 supply chain organizations within GDPR rules, of course.